The Smiling Man. It was a cold night in the city, one of those nights where the streets are quieter than usual and the air feels heavy. Mark was walking home from work, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. He had stayed late at the office, finishing up some paperwork that had been piling up. As he walked down the dimly lit street, he noticed something unusual. There was a man ahead of him. The figure stood still, a silhouette against the streetlights, his hands in his pockets. Mark didn't think much of it at first. New York City was full of strange people, especially late at night. But as he got closer, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The man was smiling. At first, Mark thought it was just a nervous grin, or maybe a happy drunk. But then he realized how wide and unnatural the smile was. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, stretching far beyond what seemed humanly possible. And his eyes were completely black, empty voids that seemed to suck in the surrounding light. Mark's heart raced as he took a step back, unsure of what to do. He considered crossing the street, but it was too late. The man had already turned toward him. The smile remained, wide and grotesque, and he started walking slowly toward Mark. Something about the way the man moved was off. It was as if he was gliding, his feet barely touching the ground. Mark quickly glanced around, but the street was empty. No one else was around. The man was closing in. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. As the man got closer, he stopped. He stood in front of Mark, still smiling, his mouth stretching impossibly wide. The silence between them grew unbearable. Mark could barely breathe, his body frozen in place. The man didn't say anything. He just kept smiling. Finally, Mark found the strength to take a step back, then another. The man's eyes didn't follow him, but his smile never wavered. Slowly, Mark turned and started walking faster, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the man's eyes on him, even though he didn't dare look back. But the faster Mark walked, the closer the man seemed to get. Every time he looked over his shoulder, the man was there, still smiling. Standing in the same spot he had been before. It didn't make sense. Mark was sure he had moved several blocks away from where he first saw him. His pace quickened to a sprint, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast he ran, the man was always just behind him, his smile never faltering. Finally, in a panic, Mark turned into an alleyway, hoping to lose the man in the darkness. He stumbled over the uneven pavement, his mind racing. He had to get away. He couldn't outrun him, but maybe if he hid. The alley was empty. There was no one there. The man wasn't behind him anymore, but Mark could feel the cold presence closing in. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he knew, deep down, that the man was watching him from somewhere close. A low, slow chuckle echoed from the shadows. Mark froze. He turned around. There, in the far corner of the alley, was the man, still smiling. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Before he could react, the man stepped forward, his body distorting. It wasn't human anymore. His arms grew long and bent at unnatural angles, and his smile stretched further than it should. The man's body rippled like something out of a nightmare, shifting and contorting. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite a voice, the man whispered, "I'm not letting you go." Mark couldn't move. His entire body was locked in place, the terror so deep it felt like it was crushing him. In the blink of an eye, the man was gone. The smile faded into the shadows, and Mark was left alone in the alley, gasping for air. The fear that gripped him didn't leave, the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was still watching. Him stayed with him. Mark ran the rest of the way home, never looking back. He never saw the man again. but every time he walked alone at night, he could feel the weight of eyes on him, the sensation of someone smiling in the shadows, just out of sight. It's said that the smiling man still roams the streets of New York, and maybe even in your city too. If you ever feel like someone is watching you in the dark, don't look back. Because if you do, you might just see that same wide grin.